Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is P.B. Anand. I think I know almost everyone in this room. It's my privilege to be the head of the Peace Studies and International Development Division. Among many things that the division is proud of, one of them is the tradition of having these kind of public discussions and debates on matters and topics of interest to not only students and researchers, but which exercise our mind more widely with regard to our impact on the community, both locally and globally. One of these activities is the annual development lecture. I'm saying annual, but we have not been able to manage to do them every year. But so far, the fact that there have been 23 previous development lectures that have taken place is kind of a testimony to having this interest and also sharing that interest more widely and discussing and debating issues of relevance to today. If you take a quick look at the various topics that have been the subject of previous development lectures, the 23 development lectures, we haven't fully succeeded in getting all of them by PDF online. We are working on it, but I think we have gone back as far as up to about 11th development lecture. So we are working on the first 10, which were pre-computer era. So we have got the lectures, but we have to do some scanning, etc. But that also suggests the historic significance of these lectures. And we are absolutely privileged to have Professor Shirley Congdon, our Vice Chancellor, to chair today's lecture. And Professor Congdon will introduce our lecturer, and then we will have the development lecture. So could you please join me in welcoming Professor Shirley Congdon? I would now like to hand over to Professor Congdon.
I find it very difficult to sit and speak, but it feels very odd. I'm going to try and stand up, actually. Can you hear me if I speak? Can you hear me? Yeah. Brilliant, yeah, because I need to see everybody. So it's a delight to be here this evening. I just said to Patrick in the way in, how many, which is this number of development lectures, and he said 24. But I hadn't realised there hadn't been one every year. So it's an amazing achievement for a department in Bradford to sustain 24 development lectures. It's a really, really significant achievement. And every year to attract such significant and important people, such as Professor Sen. So I'm not going to say too much, just want to make sure that everybody knows that the University of Bradford is really proud of the work that it's done in this field, the work in development, in international development and peace, and now peace and development, and we intend to support this work going forward significantly. So I'd very much like to welcome Professor Kunal Sen to the University of Bradford. I know you've met some of our students this afternoon. I hope they were impressive.
Absolutely.
And I'm just going to introduce him by reading his biography in the usual way. So Professor Kunal Sen is the Director of the United Nations University, World Institute for Development Economics. And you've heard something about these things today and on the video. He's Professor of Development Economics in the Global Development Institute, the University of Manchester. He's also a Research Fellow of IZA Bonn. Previously, he's been a member of the faculty at many universities, including the University of East Anglia in the UK, Massey University in New Zealand, his Australian National University, and the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in India. It's an amazing ability to get around the world. His principal areas of research are political economy, macroeconomics, international trade, and the analysis of labour markets in developing countries. He has been a principal researcher of DFID funded institutions for pro-poor growth research programme, and subsequently the Effective States and Inclusive Development ESID programme. So whilst the principal region of his research is India, he also works in East Asia, Sub-Sahara Africa, and is a member of the ESRC Peer Review College and a council member of the European Association for South Asian Students. You can't fail to be impressed with a background such as that, and we're absolutely honoured and delighted to have you to present the lecture to us tonight. So I invite you to take the stand.
Thank you. And as Professor Kunal, thank you so much for the generous introduction. I will also stand and speak because it's much easier doing it. I can see all of you doing that, and I might move around a little bit because I enjoy doing that too. What I want to say is that I'm very pleased to be here to give the Bradford 24th Development Lecture. I've been to University of Bradford several times. Thanks to invitation from Dr. Anand and others here. And so it's been wonderful coming back here. There are many of you who I know very well for the last few years since I've been here. And it's great to be back here again. What I'm going to talk about, but before I do that, because you saw the video, so I need to just say that The Hunger and Public Action, the book, was not online till 24th October, which was the UN Day. We made a commitment to Amartya Sen and Andres that we would make it online, open access, and we did that on the UN Day. So now if you go to the OUP website or our website, the book can be downloaded for free. And if any of you have not read the book, it's a very important book. But we're not only doing that, we're going to make all of Amartya Sen and Andres' books, there were 9 volumes they did afterwards, The Political Economy of Hunger, which was very important in the way development policy evolved after that. All of that open access over the next few months. Along with that, we'll also make Martha Nussbaum's book, The Quality of Life, which has been a very important book, to open access. So keep on checking our website. Because we make a commitment that whatever we do in UN Wider has to be open access. We don't believe in a situation where people cannot access it in different parts of the world. So just wanted to mention that to you, and it's really will be great for you to try and have access to these books over the next few months. Maybe it'll take another 3-4 months before everything's on open access, but that's our commitment. So I'm going to be talking about something quite different, the capabilities approach, which is what the film was about. I'll be talking about something that is actually perhaps more now than ever become a really important problem. It's become an important problem because we are in a situation that many parts of the developing world we're seeing a jobs crisis. And it's not probably also the developing world and maybe many parts of the developed world. Including the UK, we see a jobs crisis. Except perhaps one region which has not completely followed the trend elsewhere is East Asia, and we can discuss that later. But that's probably the only exception among the developing world. And what we're really seeing now is that we have seen jobs that are there that are not paying well. Not paying well, precarious livelihoods. You're often in a situation where you don't know what the next paycheck might come in. You might not know whether you're going to be actually working for the next few months. Things are very uncertain for many workers in the global south. We also see high risk informality. A lot of workers are in the informal sector. They don't have social protection. They don't have labor law protection. They are in an extremely difficult situation. I'm going to try and understand why that's the case. And of course, we see significant gender gaps in productive jobs. So we see women are more likely to be in poorly paid or actually more likely to be in unpaid jobs. So we see significant problems of jobs crisis, which is particularly manifests itself in informality, and also we see significant gender gaps in productive jobs. So that's something that we need to think about. Why is that the case? So, and this is something very important because the UN 2015 decided that they're going to have the Sustainable Development Goals that happened after the MDG agenda that was there prior to this, right? Prior to 2015. And in that agenda, they had 17 goals. And I hope most of you know what they are. I'm not going to ask you that question. But the one that is really striking is SDG Goal 8. SDG Goal 8 is about decent work. And to be honest, so just reading out what the SDG Goal 8 is, it's promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. And this SDG 8, in many ways, in my view, is the SDG is perhaps one of the most SDGs we see because it cuts across. If you don't have a productive job, if you don't have decent work, there's not much you can do to reduce poverty in that country. There's not much you can do to reduce inequality in that country. There's not much you can do to reduce gender inequality in that country. So these are different SDGs we have. SDG 1 on poverty, zero poverty. SDG 2 on having full nutrition. And SDG 5 is gender inequality. So none of those can happen, and SDG 10 is an inequality. So now the other SDGs can actually happen if you don't do something with SDG 8. And that's why it's such an important SDG. And that's exactly why I want to talk to you a little bit about what exactly is happening on the jobs crisis. So what I'm going to do in the lecture is going to first set the stage on the good jobs challenge. to sort of show you exactly what the problem is. And then I'm going to tell you why is there a deficit in good jobs? What have economists others have said? Why are we seeing this jobs crisis? And then possibly some solutions, possible ways of thinking about what we can do about the jobs crisis. So that's the way I'm going to have the three parts of my lecture. So let's look at this. Let's look at exactly the problem. If you see the developing world, and you have to sort of think about most workers in the developing world, chances are that worker that you find, wherever that person might be, is in the informal economy. And the informal economy, the ILO's definition is that the person does not have social security provision, pensions, and so on, and does not have labor law protection. That's what they are. So, and you can see it strikingly, for example, you look at Nigeria, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, about almost 90% of the workers are in the informal economy, are informal workers. Of course, as we go down the list, there are some other countries where it's much less, and that's an interesting question. Why do we see this huge variation on informality? So informality is a feature of jobs in the developing world. Chances are, as I said, that 2 out of 3 workers are in the informal sector. First point. Second is that if you look around the world and you see where are the informal workers, we already got some sense of that from the earlier graph, but you can see that essentially you can think of them being somewhere in the agriculture. They're working as subsistence farmers, smallholder agriculturists. But of course, there are others who are not in agriculture. They move to the cities, and they move to non-agricultural activities. And you can see that 2 billion, the world's employed population, representing about 61.2% of the global employment, are in the informal economy. Huge numbers, right? If you exclude agriculture, it falls a little bit, but only to 50.5. Even if you say that agriculture is a bit special, the subsistence farmers are by their nature informal, even if you take them out, you still get half of the workforce in the informal economy, informal employment. And you can see that especially in 3 parts of the world, Africa, Arab states, and Asia and the Pacific, is where we see the concentration of informal workers. So that's very striking, and it's something that one has to think about. Why do we see this huge concentration of informal workers, particularly in some parts of the developing world? Moving on, we can see also that, particularly in Africa, we have about 80% of non-agricultural employment accounted by informal work, 60% is urban employment, and a remarkable 90% of new jobs will be informal jobs, informal work. So 90% of new jobs created in Africa will be workers who will not have social protection, will not have labor law protection, all the things we take for granted in the developed world. Striking numbers. Now, if you look around again across Africa, you can see that apart from a few countries on the left-hand side of this figure, most of the case we have about more than 70% of workers in the informal economy. The one country that kind of is very different, and that's the reason for that, is South Africa. In South Africa, what we have is not workers who are in the informal economy. In South Africa, we have open unemployment. So in South Africa, it's very special because what you see there is high rates of open unemployment. But apart from South Africa and a couple of other countries on the left-hand side, you can see the high shares of workers in the informal economy. So that's something also quite striking. And as you can see, if you go to the countries out here, Niger, Benin, and so on, we're pretty much looking close to 100%. Along with this, we have another dimension which I mentioned at the beginning. We have a gender dimension of informality. So women tend to be much more likely to be own account workers or contributing family workers. The contributing family workers are working in an enterprise headed by a male, and usually contributing family workers are not paid. They are paid workers. So women are actually working without being paid in the informal economy. So not only is there a situation where we have workers who are being paid, poorly paid anyway, we have a significant proportion of the workforce, mostly women, who are not even being paid for what they're doing as unpaid workers. And you can see again quite a significant proportion of that in the Middle East. You can see that in South Asia and so on. Huge differences in the gender dimension of informality. So that's also very striking. And you can see that also in the gender gap, where we particularly see again somewhere here, mostly issues with the Middle East and North Africa. In South Asia, we see the gender gap in total employment. So in other words, the number of women employed in the informal sector, the number of men employed in the informal sector, you can see huge differences across regions. It's a specific problem, particularly in Middle East, North Africa, but also in parts of Asia. Okay, now in the informal economy, one thing I want us to keep in mind, the informal economy is not homogeneous. You might think, well, informal means no protection of whatsoever, but even in the informal economy, there's a pecking order. Right at the bottom of the pecking order are these unpaid family workers, as I said, mostly women. And then we have home workers, industrial out workers, working on contracts, usually very poorly paid, precarious kind of contracts. So these are people right just above unpaid family workers. And then you go up, you have informal wage workers, owner enterprises are self-employed people, and then you get to employers. So there is a pecking order, and you can see there's a quite significant gender dimension in the pecking order. Men are mostly here, women are mostly here. And this is work that comes from the very nice work that's been done by this very, very important civil society organization called WIGO, Women in the Informal Economy. And that's the work, so Marty Chen and others have been working on this for some time. And now we're getting better data on this, which we didn't have before. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, one other thing that's important as we think about informal employment and people working in the informal sector, one thing we know that over time, as countries become richer, there's a transition happens even in the informal economy and overall. That is the movement from self-employment to wage employment. Self-employment is pretty much a house enterprise. It's like a street vendor, right? This is the absolutely bottom of the pecking order. And then over time, they might be moving into wage employment, sometimes casual wage employment, sometimes better paid wage employment in the formal sector. So this transition that happens, as you can see from here, as countries become richer, self-employment decreases and wage employment becomes much more important. And that's something that's quite striking. So for example, if you take the UK, there's hardly any self-employment. If you take the US, there's hardly any self-employment. Most of the workers in the richer parts of the world are in wage employment. Sometimes poorly paid, of course, but at least not in a situation where they are working as in household enterprises, where really there is a problem of pay, especially among members of the household. So that's something that we notice too. And in Africa, we see most workers are self-employed, either in family firms or household enterprises. You can see the figures here. Clearly, you can see family farming is very important. A lot of people in agriculture, but also a lot of people are in house enterprises which are not even in agriculture. Self-employment is particularly a feature in the African labor market. It is also a feature in South Asia to some extent, but not as much as we see it in Latin America or East Asia, and certainly not at all in the developed world. Not at all very much in what we see in the UK and US, for example. So this thing also of self-employment is something that we see, particularly in the low-income countries. So the question then is that we're seeing a situation where, now let me just say that one of the things we learned from economic development stories, trajectories over time, is this movement that workers make from agriculture to manufacturing and services. That has happened in all the countries that become rich over time. They left agriculture and they moved to manufacturing and services. Usually first to manufacturing and then to services. So manufacturing is often seen the conveyor belt of progress. You come into manufacturing, you often get wage employment. Often you get formal wage employment. You have some protection. You have some social security provisions. So that's often seen as a conveyor belt of progress. And all the countries that have become rich, both in the past, so all of the countries in the developed world, but also more recently, like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, have also made this transition. Workers leaving agriculture, poorly paid workers in family farms, into manufacturing and then on to services. That's been the story of progress, pretty much where we've seen countries become richer, right? Now, so manufacturing has a particular property, which is something that economists always felt is special, which is that manufacturing has two things about it. One is that it's relatively productive, so you can see manufacturing here in the red. It's not as productive as tradable services, that's IT and financial services, that's very productive. But then manufacturing manufacturing is in the blue here. Manufacturing here can create more jobs. So manufacturing has this property, it's highly productive, certainly compared to agriculture, but it can create jobs. So it has those two properties which make it essentially a very important sector for job creation, because it's creating productive jobs, not jobs that are essentially where workers are essentially unproductive or poorly paid jobs. And that's something very special manufacturing, which you can see here, compared to agriculture. Agriculture productivity, as you can see, is very low compared to manufacturing. And that's essentially why when countries progress, they move their workers from here to here. And then, over time, to services too, as countries become richer. And that's the other thing that's happening, that manufacturing, which was the way countries progressed in creating jobs which were productive, seems to be in a situation where that's no longer the case. So if you look at manufacturing employment, different regions, the only region seen only country really, significant increase in manufacturing employment is China in green, here. And if anything, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is here, has actually seen decreasing share of workers in manufacturing. The poorest region in the world has seen the least amount of jobs being created in manufacturing. So we see a situation where manufacturing, we know, has this property, productive jobs. We know it's been the conveyor belt of progress historically, and we are seeing a situation where increasingly we see one part of the world, which is China and also East Asia in blue, is where most of the jobs being created in manufacturing, and jobs elsewhere being destroyed. And that's something else we have to think about. That when you talk about productive jobs, and you talk about decent work, if this is what's going to happen in the future, then there's a big problem, particularly for low-income countries in Africa and other parts and South Asia. So that's something that also is striking. Now, the question then is, so what we have seen, we've seen the following thing. We've seen informality, pervasive informality. Workers are in global South, mostly in the informal sector. Second, we're seeing significant gender gaps in productive job creation. Third, we've seen that manufacturing, which has this remarkable property of creating productive jobs, is no longer possibly a route for economic progress in many parts of the global South. So then the question is, why are we in this situation? What explains this? Why is there a lack of good jobs? And that's where, of course, there is no agreement among economists, because economists differ on their views on why is there this problem. Nobody disagrees on the problem. Everybody understands the problem. But what exactly is the reason for the problem? So there are four main causes that I will talk a little bit about. One is globalization. Second is technology. Third is lack of human capital. And fourth are policy distortions. And I will spend some time in each of them. So let's first talk about globalization. Now, globalization has been a fantastic thing for many countries which have become rich over time. The earlier countries in the Western world, of course, much earlier, but more recently, the East Asian countries in China. But globalization seems to also now is leading to a situation what Danny Roderick, the very well-known economist, has called premature deindustrialization. Countries are actually getting a situation, they're losing workers in manufacturing much before they should. Now, in the UK, manufacturing employment is not very large. Why? Most of the workers in the UK are in services. In the US, similar story. In Europe, that's a similar story. But that's quite understandable. You get to a point where manufacturing is no longer creating jobs, and people move into services. So in this part of the world, it's not surprising if you've seen movement away from manufacturing to services. But why is it happening in parts of the world where there should still be a role for manufacturing in creating productive jobs? Why are we seeing premature deindustrialization? And that's a big question. So what we're seeing is industrial employment is falling in many developing countries much earlier than historical norms. And I'll show you a graph on that. And we are seeing a situation where, while in today's rich countries, workers first move from agriculture to manufacturing, then on to services, has been the common story for all the countries in the Western world and in East Asia. What we're seeing now in the low-income countries, Sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of South Asia, our workers are moving right away to services from agriculture, but the jobs they're moving to services are street vendors and low productivity service jobs, mostly in the informal sector. So not even that they're moving to better paid jobs in banks and so on, or the IT, they're moving to low productivity informal jobs in the service sector. So we are seeing a situation where the whole path of transition that happened in many parts of the world before agriculture, manufacturing, services is no longer the route we're seeing in many other parts of the world, where actually there's still a big need to get workers into manufacturing. So that's something that's quite puzzling. Now, why is this debate of globalization? Well, the debate has been that actually for many countries which do not have an innate advantage in manufacturing, and there are many reasons why they may not have an advantage in manufacturing, they're losing out to import competition. Because remember that now almost all countries have globalized. Almost all countries have opened up the trade barriers, they've reduced trade barriers, they've opened up the economy. So almost all countries in the world have globalized in some form or the other. So there's very few countries which still have high import barriers and trade restrictions, which we used to see 20 years back. Now, for some of these countries who opened up, and this was mostly in East Asia, they benefited from opening up. But there are a lot of countries in Africa and also potentially Latin America which have lost out. So we see this asymmetrical effects of globalization, positive in some parts of the world, but negative in some other parts of the world. And there are many reasons why that's the case, that we're seeing globalization having a negative effect on manufacturing employment, say in Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. So globalization can be a powerful force for creating productive jobs, but it can also destroy jobs. And that's exactly the problem of globalization. And that's exactly why Roderick and other economists have been saying we are seeing premature deindustrialization. Now, so the region that gain, and South Asia actually, interestingly enough, they are not every country in South Asia, but Bangladesh is a great example of gaining from globalization. Some of you probably know Bangladesh has got a remarkably viable, vibrant ready-made garment sector, mostly employing women. That particular sector, the ready-made garment sector, contributes about 80% of its manufacturing exports last time I looked at the numbers, and creates a lot of jobs. So even in the other parts of the world, we're seeing some countries which actually have been gaining from globalization. But there are other countries which have not done so well, even in South Asia, for example, Nepal and India and so on. So there are these problems of, and we can see from this particular graph, which I took from Danny Roderick's very nice paper, 2016, that what we used to see before, and this is the 1990s, the broken line is 1990s, pre-1990s, and this is the post-1990s in the red. You can see before, countries at peak in manufacturing employment is on the vertical axis, much later than what we see now. So the peak that happened in the US and UK happened much later, when they become rich. But now we are seeing a situation where this is an employment, this is value added. You can see the peaking happening much earlier. And then the question is, why is it happening so much earlier? Particularly in countries where we need to have manufacturing creating jobs. So that's what we seem to see on premature deindustrialization. As I said, there are still debates about this. What exactly explains this, if we do believe that this is right? And there's still some questions about whether actually what we're seeing is true or not for every country. So there is a debate about that. Now, this is just some numbers I put together on trade. Now, there's no doubt, and this is trade over GDP, no doubt every part of the world has seen increasing globalization. No doubt about that. Trade on GDP is a good measure of that. You can see the trade over GDP is going up in the developed world, the developing world, and the underdeveloped world. So that's a very clear number. Of course, there was a bit of a blip here when there was a global financial crisis, but overall the trend is strongly positive. And in this graph, I just put together a scatter where I have trade over GDP against manufacturing employment for the underdeveloped, which I call underdeveloped countries in structural transformation, countries which have not really been able to get their workers out of agriculture, and you kind of see this negative correlation. And you can see right away that for this set of countries, you seem to see that opening up seems to be leading to or be correlated with decreasing manufacturing employment. This is correlations are not causal, so I'm not running regressions here, simple scatters. But that's something to think about. Okay, the next cause, technology, automation. Increasingly, what we're seeing in manufacturing is jobs getting destroyed. Increasingly, we're seeing computerization coming in, automation coming in. What used to be possible before with human labor, you don't need workers anymore in many, many different production lines. Automation is a big threat for job creation everywhere. And what's really happening, and the interesting thing about automation is that it's particularly hitting two kinds of workers. Who are the ones who are getting hit? Production workers in factories and clerical workers in services. Why? Because production work can be automated very easily, and clerical work can be automated very easily. Clerical work, you can bring computerization in. Production work, you're getting robots. So in those two areas, we're seeing huge effects of technology and automation. Now, the interesting thing here is that these two groups of workers were essentially, for example, in the rich countries, the middle class, the middle skilled workers. So in a way, what's happening is it's actually hitting the workers, which in many rich countries were the ones who formed the middle class. Factory workers, clerical workers were the middle class. A lot of women were as clerical workers, for example, in the US. So those are the ones that are getting very badly hit by technology and automation. And you can see in this one I took from the World Health Report, or this came out this year, that what we're really seeing is a very interesting situation. This is the ordered by susceptibility to automation. So this is where automation is hitting the most, and this is automation hitting the least. The ones which are really quite likely where jobs can be automated, you can see employment decreasing quite a bit. But of course, automation technology creates jobs too. And that's a puzzle, right? So you also see innovation creating new employment in new sectors. But what are they? Those are jobs which are highly skilled jobs. Cognitive ability. You need to be thinking to work in this kind of sectors, IT, software programmers, for example. There's been a boom in software programmers in the world. That needs human ingenuity, needs creativity, needs thinking. Not the kind of jobs we often saw in this group. So at one level, we're seeing jobs being destroyed here in this group of workers, and we're seeing jobs being created, but mostly in highly skilled occupations. So jobs are being destroyed, jobs are being created, but in very different kinds of occupation, different kinds of skills. And it's not surprising that these jobs here, which are being created, are not going to be very likely to be seen in many low-income countries. While this kind of jobs that are being destroyed are the ones we often see in developing countries. So there is this effect of technology which is also asymmetrical, like globalization. But this asymmetry is not to do with regional differences, this is to do within the country itself. If you're a software programmer, there's a demand for you. You're going to get a job, wherever you are. If you are working in a factory or working as a clerical worker, it's quite likely that you might find that in some years your job is no longer there for you. So even in the same country, you see this asymmetrical effects of technology. So it's a very different situation than globalization. It's a within-country effect. And that's something else that one has to think about. Why are we seeing this very significant within-country effects? This is again very clearly from the World Health Report. You can see that highly skilled workers, and this is for different countries in the global south, you can see highly skilled workers are the ones where occupations are growing. And that you can see around you. All the new jobs are being created in these highly skilled occupations. So you can see in blue the highly skilled occupations, and you can see the middle skilled occupations are the ones particularly getting hit. And then sometimes also low skilled occupations, which is in yellow, sometimes also getting very hit, for example, in Ethiopia. Now, low skilled occupation is something I want to explain to you, that there are two kinds of low skilled occupation. You might be working in a factory sometimes, but also a lot of work in low skilled occupations cannot be automated. Think about people who are cleaning staff in the university, for example. That kind of work is not easily automated. So there is this thing that some jobs are still safe jobs because they cannot be automated that easily. So there is this interesting thing that's probably why you see the big effects are happening in the middle skilled occupations where jobs can be automated. And that's why we're seeing this big drops in those kind of jobs. But those are jobs which used to give you the formal sector jobs. They're the ones who give you the well-paid jobs and are working in a factory or working in an office. Those are the ones who actually provided the formal sector, formal employment to you. But those are the ones actually getting hit by technology and automation. And what's really also happening, and this is another graph that I thought was interesting, really, is that the rate of technology diffusion is increasing. I mean, if you look at over time, the things that have happened in technology, now, of course, we have artificial intelligence. The rate of technology diffusion is increased significantly in the last 10 years, 10, 15 years. So technology is moving rapidly. As it's moving rapidly, it is creating new opportunities, but only for those who have the skills and have the necessary abilities. But it's also at the same time having a very negative effect for many others who do not have the skills, do not have those opportunities. And that's exactly, and one cannot reverse this trend because this is going to carry on, as we know. So that's technology. Okay, human capital. In the last 10, 15 years, especially, I think the MDGs had a lot to do with it. Children are in school now. Many parts of the world, we can now have close to 100% primary enrollment. And the great thing there is both girls and boys are in school. Gender gaps in primary enrollment has pretty much been closing now in most countries. Secondary enrollment, still a bit of a gap. There again, there's been progress. But primary enrollment, which 20, 30 years back, there were hardly any children in school in Africa and Asia and so on, that has changed dramatically. But the problem is, schooling ain't learning. So what has happened is children are going to school, they come to class, and this is a lot of good, and there was a very good World Bank report on this actually. What's happening is that they're not really gaining learning in schools. There's a lot of reasons for that, and we can discuss that in the Q&A, but the real challenge right now is to make children learn, because learning is what's important. What you kind of end up after spending 8, 10 years in school, you're going to be in the modern workforce with the necessary skills that you need to compete with this rapid change in technology that's happened. And if you haven't learned enough in school, you don't really have a chance. So that's been one huge problem. And I think that what's also has combined with this is technology. Technology increases demand for higher order general cognitive skills. You need complex problem solving skills. You need critical thinking. You need advanced communications. And that cannot be transferred that cannot be done only through schooling. A lot of that happens on the job, learning in the job. How do you think about a problem? How do you solve a problem? A lot of this happens in universities and not in primary schooling itself. And that's been a problem. That technology is actually pushing up the learning frontier. And many parts of the developing world, they're not anywhere near the frontier we need for providing the skills in the workforce. So there's a huge problem with human capital, which is not to do with schooling itself, but learning. And tertiary education, vocational training is very important, but what is also very unfortunate is that tertiary education still is, in many parts of the developing world, not well funded. Universities are not well funded. And there is a reason for that. You have a budget constraint, where do you put your money in? Primary schooling. And that's a good reason, and that should always be the case. But then, as we move to this new world of technology, you need the university graduates. And you also need vocational training to prepare your workers for all the new jobs of tomorrow. And that's not happening as much as it should in many countries in the world, in the global south. So that's a huge problem. And if you look at the Human Capital Index, this is a very nice index that has been put together by the World Bank. So you have Singapore right at the top. This is the measures the productivity of the worker related to the frontier. Singapore is almost close to the frontier in what human capital can give. And then you go down this list, and there's Korea, there's Japan, there's Hong Kong, Ireland, Germany, US, and so on. And as you go down here, and then you come here, and you see Burundi, DRC Congo, Mozambique, Liberia, Niger, Mali, Chad, several African countries, some others also, but mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see the gap here and the gap versus here. Huge difference in human capital index, which is telling you the quality of the human capital. And when you see this kind of graph, you really feel quite terrified. You think, my God, what's going to happen here with these countries as we get to the new technological frontier? How are they going to compete with the kind of technology we're seeing happening around the world, the kind of huge advance in technology that you're seeing around the world? So that's that's something quite a remarkable graph in my view, and I was quite struck by it. So the final thing I want to say about what are the reasons, we should not forget that while we can blame globalization, technology, we can also see human capital is also a factor behind this, countries make mistakes in their policies. So that is something is also the case. And what often happens in the developing world is we see policies which are well-intentioned. There was a reason for the policy, but they lead to bad outcomes. Let me take an example from Latin America. And this is really a powerful example because this is an example of how often we make mistakes ourselves in thinking what we think is a good policy can be a bad policy. So in Latin America, what happens is that if you're a worker in the formal sector, there's a contributory social insurance program. You contribute to your pension, your employer contributes to your pension. Both contribute to your pension, and that builds up over time. You spend 30, 40 years working in the formal sector, you get a good, nice pension. If you're in the informal sector, Latin America, you don't get that because there's no firm that can provide the pension. What do you get? The government then gives you a non-contributory social insurance. So you get a pension from the government or any kind of social insurance from the government, tax financed. Now you might say that's a good thing. These workers are not being left out in the cold. That's actually good. No, it's not. Why is it not the case? This is something that it was very, very good work done by Santiago Levy, who was the person behind Progreso, Mexico's iconic social transfer program. He gave the annual lecture in Wider recently. If you want it, it's on our YouTube channel. The point is that when you have a situation where you are taxing the formal sector and you're subsidizing the informal sector, guess what happens? Formal firms figure out, well, I don't want to hire this worker and pay this contributory pension. I'd rather give the worker an informal contract. I'd rather give the worker a contract that's not legal, perhaps, because I don't want to pay this pension for the worker. The worker says, well, I don't want to pay this pension either. I don't want to contribute my pension either. I'd rather be in the informal sector because there I get the non-contributory insurance, so a pension, which I'm getting free without any cost to me. So what happens then is, a situation has happened in many Latin American countries, is workers and firms get out of the formal sector into the low productivity informal sector, which is because of an absolutely bad policy environment, which was well-intentioned in the first place. So the whole idea behind the policy environment was actually that, oh yeah, we should do something with the informal workers, not realizing the perverse incentives that were created by creating this wedge between the formal sector and the informal sector. Taxing the formal sector, subsidizing the informal sector. And that, many Latin American economists will say, is the reason why Latin America has this huge problem of productivity and informality. Latin America should not have a problem with informality because Latin America is fairly rich now. Many countries are almost close up, they become moved up to the high income status now, Colombia, for example. And yet in Latin America, you see countries like after country where informality is pretty much not very different from Africa. And the one very important reason for that is this policy environment which is creating this wedge in the formal and the informal sector. Now, you might say, now I'll come back to you might say to me that are we then saying here that we're going to remove this non-contributory social insurance and give the informal workers nothing? That's a good question, but I'll come back to that question afterwards in the discussion, the policy, how we can do something here. But this is an important point because this tells us that informality is not something innate. When you see informality in a country like Mexico, 70% of workers are informal. Firms are like normal, firm size there is like 2-3 workers. Small little firms who don't want to move to the formal sector. There is a reason for that also. Independent of globalization, independent of technology, independent of anything else, it's bad policies. And at least policies can be fixed. That's the good point here. You can change policies. Okay, so that's something we need to think about. So basically what we see, certainly in Latin America, maybe not as much in Africa and Asia, is this problem of good jobs not being there because of bad policies. Okay, now what can we do about it? Now I'm an optimist on globalization. I always believe globalization is a good thing. I think it can be managed. We can do something about harnessing its positive side and do something about its negative side. So I'm not somebody who believes that we should put up the trade barriers and close down economies. Those days are gone. It's not possible anymore. So you got to think about what kind of jobs or what kind of new industries can be created, even when you might, as a country, have a disadvantage in conventional manufacturing. So Wider has been doing some work on industries without smokestacks, agri-processing, tourism, potentially where countries can move in without having to face China or Vietnam in conventional manufacturing. Because competing with China and Vietnam or any of the other countries of Southeast Asia in conventional manufacturing is difficult. There's no doubt about that. So that's one thing. But even within conventional manufacturing, there's still room to maneuver. Ethiopia is a good example there. Ethiopia has actually done very well in manufacturing compared to many other African countries. Why is that the case? This is a picture of the biggest special economic zone we have in Ethiopia. Why? Because the government said, no, we're going to do something about this. We're not going to accept the situation that we have. And the government started investing in special economic zones. Garments came in, horticulture, leather, and so on. Yes, if they are not, we cannot compare Ethiopia to China or Vietnam or Thailand, but Ethiopia is doing something different than many other African countries. So it's possible to do something about it. You need a state that can understand the problem, try to fix it, and you need also private sector. In this case, in the case of Ethiopia, many foreign investors come in from China and other parts of the world. So that's a good example where there is still space for many countries, even with the constraints that they're facing, to do something about it. And this is where I feel that what you need is a state that is visionary, can understand the problems, and a private sector that responds to the state. Often in many parts of the world where we haven't seen manufacturing do well, we have a state that often creates more problems for the private sector, and the private sector which often has other objectives, not really getting into productive jobs, for example. They might be interested in other issues, other ways to make profits, but not really interested in doing something in terms of creating jobs. So we need a kind of a state and private sector getting together, and there have been examples of that. The other country I would pick up in the African context is Rwanda, not as much as in Ethiopia, but again, Rwanda is trying to do something about it with a very committed state, which is trying to do something about it in coffee processing, for example. So there are examples like that. I'm not going to make I do think there is still a lot of, there are constraints for countries to come into manufacturing against low-cost manufacturing that's coming in from Southeast Asia or China, but there is still potential that can be exploited if you can think about it far enough. So that's the first point. Second point is technology. Now, technology is interesting because at one level, I've showed you some of the negative side of technology. But there is an argument that technology is actually going to let countries do something which you couldn't do before. Why? Because with digital technology, you can actually stay where you are and you can tele-migrate. You can essentially run a robot sitting in, say, Philippines that can help out in an old person's home in Japan. So what's going on with digital technology, and there's a very nice book by Richard Baldwin on this, and he's got a paper coming out in our working paper series, who's arguing that actually technology can allow us to do things for which we could never think we could do, especially in services. And the argument is that maybe what we're seeing now is services becoming the new manufacturing. Not all of services, some services. Because this kind of service that we are seeing, where we are allowing remote workers seem less remote through communications, this service is productive services, tradable services. It has learning by doing effects that we see in manufacturing. It may not create as many jobs as in manufacturing. Yes, there is a constraint on that. But certainly services allows now countries which had a problem with manufacturing before to come into the global stage. And we are already seeing evidence of that. So if services become the new manufacturing, then maybe we should not think of manufacturing as the route to economic development as we always thought in the past. Maybe we need to rethink this. And I'm not sure whether I have the answer to this. But I think we need to, as economists especially, rethink our priors on what we thought was the growth sector in the economy. Maybe it's not manufacturing anymore. Maybe it's a new services. And if it's the new services, what do countries need to do to try and do something about getting better communication, better skills in the workers, so they can take advantage of the digital technology that's allowing for telecommunication, telemigration, which wasn't possible before. So that's something to think about. And I think we still haven't got a good, clear sense of what's the possibility here. And I think we can talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, human capital accumulation. There's been so much work on human capital accumulation by economists, but it's one thing that comes out very clearly. If you don't invest in a child early enough, it's probably too late. That's pretty much 0 to 5 years. Okay? In that first 5 years of the child's life is when a lot of cognitive skills are built. And if the child is undernourished, the child is not getting the kind of support the child needs through early childhood education programs, so on, you're not going to see much afterwards for the child as the child gets into more mature age. One reason why in Mexico, Progresa, and I hope all of you know Progresa, this conditional cash transfer was given to mothers that they would get the money only if they brought the child into the health clinics and they would give the child supplements, nutrition supplements, so on. One evidence we have from Mexico Progresa was it did a hugely positive effect on children's education. There were big gains in Mexico through Progresa, because Progresa was absolutely tied into childhood education, investing in childhood education. We are seeing more evidence of such conditional cash transfers in Latin America, less so in Africa and Asia, I would say. There's a bit of resistance to that in Africa and in Asia. But in Latin America, Bolsa Family is another example. And so the point here is that we now know that we've got to do something here. We've got to do something in the first 5 years of a child's life. Because if you don't do something then, probably it's too late. Second thing is also, that's the early childhood part, but also now, because of the problem of technology, workers losing their jobs in particular areas, you've got to have adult learning programs. So you've got to act at the beginning of the child, at the very early part of a person's life, and maybe much later on. So adult learning programs are very important. And here again, I think there are many countries developing countries, which haven't really thought about adult learning programs. There is a huge problem with vocational training programs. I mean, if you look around you in the developing world, vocational training programs are provided by the state, government-run institutions, which have no sense of what the modern workforce looks like. There's a huge need to reform the vocational training programs, let the private sector come in, let them take it over, because they know what they want from the workers. Still a lot of resistance to have the private sector entering vocational training programs. So there are things we can do on the human capital side, and again, this point here, this graph is that ultimately the ones who are suffering the most, for example, early childhood education programs, if they're not able to do it, are the ones from the poorest backgrounds. So from that point of view, there's even a further reason why we should try to invest in early childhood education programs, because the ones who do not get access to those programs are the disadvantaged children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there's a lot of things here which come in. This is really the beginning of the process when we are now thinking of learning versus schooling. And there are a lot of things that we have to think about, but it's a start to think about how to increase learning outcomes in children and adults than just purely think of schooling, which is what we used to think about before in the MDG agenda. So that's something to think about. Okay, policy distortions. The problem here is that why do governments still carry on with poor policies? So why has Mexico still carried on with the policy environment, which, as I said, has been shown to be clearly leading to a situation of high informality and low productivity? The answer to that is often political. It is difficult to change a policy. Partly the problem is that policymakers have blinkered approaches. They think, okay, I can see this problem, let me do something about it. Progresa is a good example. Progresa came in because Mexico was going through a major crisis in 1995. After the peso crisis, Mexico was in very difficult economic situation. There was a high increase in poverty. Progresa came in, and that was the reason. But progress by itself could not change what happened in Mexico afterwards, which was high informality and low productivity. Even though Mexico managed to globalize, NAFTA came in, there was quite a lot of macroeconomic stability, a lot of things that happened in the past was not repeated. Successive governments are very careful about macroeconomic stability, but Mexico could not move to a high growth path and high productivity path. Now, that's where you have to have policymakers who can see the overall picture and then take difficult decisions. So here's what would have been a possible solution in Mexico. They should have removed the non-contributory social insurance programs. Absolutely politically very, very difficult, but they should have done that. And what they should have done, as argued by Santiago Levy in this lecture they gave in WIDER last couple of weeks back, gone for a universal social insurance program. Everybody gets the same benefit. It doesn't matter if you're formal or informal, the work doesn't matter. You get the same benefits, same access to hospitals, same access to healthcare, everything. It's exactly the same. Financed by tax, high tax, by taxation, of course. So what that means is that you take away the disincentive that happens when you have programs that are given pensions, so on, by work employment status. Now that kind of move from contributory, non-contributory social insurance to universal provision of pension, so on, is a huge move, because that would mean that you have to increase taxes to finance that, right? And that's difficult. So first problem is you're going to take away something from the workers who always got that in the informal sector. That's difficult. Second problem is that you've got to do something that's a universal program that has to be tax financed. That's difficult. So all of this then creates a situation the governments often just say, okay, this is just too difficult, let me not try doing it. But all they're doing really then is condemning the lives of workers who are in the informal sector for many years to be in the situation where they are not very well paid and living precarious livelihoods. So that's the policy challenge that's there. And this is not Mexico is one example. This is being faced in many other Latin American countries. In the African context, in the South Asian context, where there's also a problem of jobs, as we saw, there the problem is that the formal sector is going to be providing very few jobs. And the reason for that is manufacturing is not really viable, certainly in Africa, in many countries, as a major provider of jobs. But then the question is that what do we do with this high rates of informality in these countries? And one solution to that is that you've got to find ways to try to think the informal sector as where workers will be for quite a long time, maybe forever. There's still a view that the informal sector is going to go away. We've got to find a way to get in the formal sector, and that's often the problem that if you want to start thinking about the informal sector, say, okay, what can I do to make the life of somebody who's working in a household enterprise better? What can I do to make sure that somebody who's a household enterprise, who works in a household enterprise, actually becomes bigger in terms of size and starts employing other workers? And once you start seeing informal sector as a sector which is quite heterogeneous in the way it is, then you start thinking about what can I do in the different parts of the informal sector where maybe you can bring in different kinds of policies that can have different effects. There is still a reluctance to think of the informal sector in that way, and that might be one part of the problem, but of course it's not the only reason. But that also has to be done. So that's essentially to do with the political problems with handling informality and the lack of good jobs. So what I want to say at the end is that, there is no question that SDG 8 is a defining policy challenge for all of us. If we don't get SDG 8, some progress in SDG 8 by 2030, we're going to see a major problem. That's already seeing that, because we're seeing a situation that for many workers in the informal sector who are going to be there for years and maybe generations, it's not something that can hope to have if you want to have even progress in the other SDGs. So SDG 8 is absolutely crucial to understanding everything else. Along with that, we have to think about the fact that when we have a situation, as we saw in the Arab Spring, young workers, educated workers coming into the job market, not finding work, we can see the problems of that in terms of political stability. So not only do we have an economic problem, which is poor job, poorly paid jobs, and workers living in informality for many years and many generations, and we have a political problem at the same time. So together, this is a serious issue. And we need to find ways to solve this problem, because if we can't do something about it, then I think there is a real big question of what will happen in many of these countries for the next 20, 30 years. And this is where I think that we got to find ways for the state and the private sector to kind of get together and do something about it. And this is something what I feel also is a problem here, because the SDGs were aspirational, but there was not really any resources that were kept aside to finance the different SDGs. So we have a situation where we have these 17 SDG goals, and there are not really any kind of commitment, either by national governments, but even by multilateral agencies and others, to try and think about how do we finance the SDG achievements? How do we finance trying to create jobs, trying to do something about education, health, and the different other SDGs? So there is this problem with the SDG agenda itself that is to do with the lack of resources that we have, where the idea was to mobilize resources, both the private sector and the states, member states. That hasn't happened. So there is an overall problem that I think is there with the 2030 agenda, but there is a specific problem which is to do with the fact that there is a particular problem with the fact we don't have enough good jobs. Let me stop here.